Well, hi, Vivienne. My name's Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we went for a nice walk the other day along Riverside Park in Manhattan, and I got to talk a little bit about your work. And you know, you told me you're someone whose art and work relates to language and history, but language in a way. And I asked if that meant that you worked in metaphor, and you had. I think your reaction was not sure, and it's very interesting to me because for Hannah Arendt, metaphor is at the very sort of center of the linguistic ability to say the ineffable, to say what's hidden. And so I'm wondering just a little bit. Tell me, in what sense does metaphor play in your work? You work with symbols, you work with repeating signs. I would
Yeah.
think of those often as metaphors. I'm just wondering how you think of them.
No, in fact, I agree. I mean, there's no notion of art or anything that we think about it, which, of course, we can only do via language without the carrying vessel of metaphor. I mean, there's no thinking of it without the dynamic of the idea of metaphor. So I can't disagree with that. I see that I did, when we agreed, well, this is an informal chat, but since I imposed a bunch of catalogs on you to give you some idea of what it is that I do, and you suggested that I try reading the Arendt on language and metaphor. I was happy to do that, and then I noticed that I did read it. Of course, you were kind enough to photocopy these pages for me, and it turned out, in fact, I did have a copy of The Human Condition, from whence it came, and I wanted to tell you that no matter whether I read it from this copy or from the photocopied copy, I had a lot of problems understanding it. It was really hard for me to read. And I am absolutely convinced, I mean, first of all, it may be because my brain is not trained in philosophical, rational logic. So that's probably the main issue. But I'm also convinced that it is, in fact, this language issue where I was so upset, so disturbed when you told me, when you confirmed that, in fact, Arendt wrote so many of her books in English, and I'm not even sure what that means, because, as you also explained, she had help, if you like. I mean, she worked on it with others. She didn't just think in English and write it all by herself. I just wonder what this would have been had she done it, had she written it in her mother tongue, just in the sense of thinking of, if you were conducting your own psychoanalysis in a learned language as opposed to a mother tongue. I mean, it's not that you can't do it, it's just that it's something different, surely. But in any case, I wanted to tell you how difficult I found it. And to read. I did find much sort of something that was more accessible to me, but not any less painful, which was when she actually writes here in this chapter, in The Human Condition, when she writes on the permanence of the world and the work of art. Now, this was painful for me to read because it's quaint, arcane, really hard at this point in time for me as a woman to swallow it in the way. And also, I find it quaintly ideal in a way. There's a kind of idealism in it that that there isn't in sort of postmodern or postmodern thinking about art and the making of it and the processes of it and the and how we think about it, how we look at it, and for whom we make it, etc., etc. So I just wanted to say, I sound when I tell you about it now, it sounds much more serious than it was. I actually had, it was painful for me, but I did have a laugh about it as well. I mean, you know, she really is such an astonishing thinker. She really not only how she wrote about things, but the things that she actually thought about, the things that she brought into material subjects. And I have to say that, you know, some of the earlier works, I mean, there, you know, she's got her classical sort of Marxism on full display. She really you know, she really writes from her, she really thinks from her tradition,
Yeah,
where she comes from.
yeah. I want to pick up on a few things you said, Vivienne, which I think are really important and perceptive. So Arendt, in writing about work in the human condition, right, says
Yeah.
that one of the things that work does is it creates things that don't just help us live. Labor produces bread that helps us live, but work produces things that last, that stick around, and that thereby create some sort of a common world, a preserved world, and that part of the human condition is to be born into a world that already exists, and that one and there's a need, you know, and she wants to say a human need to live in a world that precedes us and that will last after we're dead. And that's part of what it means to be human, or has been what it means to be human for thousands of years. Her worry, or her thinking in the human condition, is that that's increasingly in peril, right? And this is, you know, she's a, you know, she's not a postmodern thinker in any kind of labeled way, but she's someone who believes in the loss of the sort of metaphysical tradition.
Precisely, precisely. The impermanence of the permanence that she writes about.
Exactly. And so much of what she's doing, whether she's doing it through philosophy or thinking or politics or art, is asking, how do we as humans live in a world in which there isn't this permanence, in which there isn't this tradition, which she calls the break in tradition, she thinks undeniable and can't be put back together. And one of the reasons she's so attracted to thinkers like Walter Benjamin, who I know you are also attracted to, is because she sees in Benjamin and his, what she calls Benjamin's thesis or idea of quotability or citability, she calls it.
Right.
She calls it in an essay on Benjamin, the strange power of the past to settle piecemeal in the present and deprive it of peace of mind, complacency. That struck me as something that had a lot of resonance with your work. I'm wondering if that quote resonates with you.
That's a really beautiful quote. Her saying that is actually pure poetry. I think that Benjamin, you know, whose famous ambition was to write the great 19th century novel from what was it, quotations or something, and his wanderings and the flaneur and the arcades and things brought us the sort of the manifestation of Fragment, because he was a 19th century person with a 20th century sensibility and intellect, and this you know, imagine just that the whole sort of romantic 19th century was a glass orb that smashed on the ground. Benjamin's intellectual terrain are those shards, those bits. And no, it can never be made whole again. But the one thing is how those shards for Benjamin, and here I'm waxing metaphorically, you know, he really, that each one is a prism, and he really and also magnifies things. And so I think that you know, this is of course, you know, he wasn't alone in that. This sensibility was also very powerfully expressed in Dada, you know, in Dada, and yes, the fragmented, not only the fragmented world, but essentially the fragmented sense of self, that you know, sense of self in the world, where we stand in relation to the, you know, our idea of the universe, or to nature, and no, we can never occupy secure ground ever again, or think that we do.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. No, I think, and Arendt speaks of it as the destructive power of quotations. And what she says is that when Benjamin used quotations, originally he wasn't seeking to destroy, he was seeking to preserve. And yet what he discovered unintentionally, this is Arendt's reading of Benjamin, is the destructive power of quotations. And so that really strikes me about Benjamin, and I think it's very important for Arendt. I'm wondering if you think, you know, you've described your paintings, and people have described your paintings as quotations, as taking things out of context, decontextualizing, recontextualizing, very much, I think, somewhat how Benjamin imagined it. Do you think of your painting as an act of destruction or reconstruction? Or Arendt also says that it's a way, she calls it, to write this way, or maybe in your case, to paint this way, is the gift of thinking poetically. And I'm wondering if you think of yourself as doing poetry through art or quotations, as destroying, as creating. Is there a goal? Is there an end? What is it you're aiming at in your use of these quotations, in your employment of quotations?
Well, I mean, not to get off too lightly, but obviously the making of anything is all of those things that you mentioned. It's reconstructing, it's destroying, whatever. I think, though, there in thinking about you know, art of the 20th century and into the 21st century, though, I think that the great sort of modernist aspiration was to destroy. I mean, Dada at least made a lot of noise about destroying. I wouldn't say that it destroyed. Yeah, it destroyed certain bankrupt notions, for sure. But I think that for the first time, destruction as an aspiration for being creative, or making anything of worth, or having anything meaningful to say, I think is about destroying sort of what's come before it, you know, and somehow this is tied with some also fairly messed up and at this point fairly indistinct notion of originality, you know what I mean? So I do actually consciously work, I have done since the late 80s, with a conscious idea of not using gesture to by its very nature express some notion of originality, and so I think that in a way, you know, I'm not sure that there's any originality. In any case, I'm not sure how interesting an idea of originality is. I mean, it might be, but it's just that painting in the second half of the 20th century and onwards, I mean, any painting has a completely different notion to the idea of destruction or originality that belonged to the 19th century, because all painting, no matter what it looks like, any painting anybody makes now is first and foremost about other painting, and so to deny that fact, or to be blind to that, makes an idea of originality absurd. Just to backtrack here, though, because you said, so you described when you spoke about Arendt's speaking about the tradition or permanence or whatever. I just want to bring us up to the matter of hand, and I know we're not going to talk about this because this is going to be part of the other discussion we have when we think about the preface to to Past and Future, but just her quotation from René Char, our what is it? How does she translate it? Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun. Our inheritance was left to us by no testament. Is suitably aphoristic, or in poetic terms, like a what do you call the Japanese or the ancient, just the little, what are they?
Haiku?
Yeah, haiku. Yes, it's sort of it's an aphorism. It's a haiku, but it encapsulates encapsulates all of that, because she knew because there is no. She knew when being trained in philosophical thought, whether or not she later called herself a philosopher or not. And in fact, I think she wasn't being entirely disingenuous, by the way. I think what she was is something that she invented. No one had been that before. No one had been a political philosopher before, whatever. No one had done that. But I just think that the more I think about it, the more brilliant I think that she used that quote from Char, from a poet, and poetry was something she knew very well as opposed to painting. Just that it's brilliant, because it's a brilliant description. So sorry if I don't know if I came back to my point, but
this is great. And just to follow up on the poetry aspect, I mean, Arendt would say often that she knew the entire tradition of German poetry by heart. And in fact, while she wrote most of her major works in English, almost all of her major works, she herself, we could say, translated, or we could say rewrote in German. And the German versions are translations, and yet they're rewritings. And if you ask, well, what changes? The biggest change is that she explicitly, and even sometimes not explicitly, cites poetry throughout the German rewritings. So she's often changes words that she's using in German that have resonances with Goethe, or with Hölderlin, or with other poets that she knows by heart, Auswendig by heart. And so that's the big change, and it gives her work in German a much more ineffable or poetic feeling. Now,
absolutely, it would do. I mean, she literally, here's a kind of tired metaphor, I mean, she literally would be painting with that brush of reference and association that adds the richness, the depth, the substance, and that removes itself from, let's say, jargon. I mean, I'm not so, I dare not call the bit on language and metaphor jargon, but for an outsider like me, there is enough of it. So I think that I think in any case, writing in German, and surely she couldn't deny this. I mean, it's really surprising to me, though. It's so surprising to me that she did that. Why did she say why she was not going to be writing in German, or did she consider it to be so obvious because she was living in America that she did she?
Well, she was trying to make a living. I mean, we have to remember, like yourself and your family, she was a refugee. She was stateless for 17 years. She came to the United States as a refugee, given asylum with a little bit of money that they gave her, but she had nothing, and she had to support herself, her mother, and her husband, who also didn't have work.
Mm,
So, most of her writing in the first 10 years she was in America was to make money.
mm,
She wrote for newspapers, she wrote for journals,
mm,
and she had to write in English. That was, I mean, she wrote a couple pieces in German for Aufbau and other things.
mm.
Um, but she had to write, and she was writing for a market, so she wanted to write in English. I think
Yeah.
she came to absolutely love America.
Yes. Well,
And
she would have experienced it as her savior. I mean, and actually, one, I am certain, and I bet you she even commented on this one way or another. I'm sure that when she got to New York, she must have felt that for all the problematic and the issues of Zionism and the Israel wars from the 1967 and the whole Palestinian issue and the problems in Israel, I am quite sure that she must have felt consciously that she could breathe, because no matter what, this was the one, perhaps the only place on earth, because it was uncontested, where it was okay for her to be Jewish, to be a
she
Jew.
says that explicitly. I mean,
Yeah.
she says, she makes so much of this in her letters and in some of her essays at this time, that this is the only state that's not a nation. That
Right.
that 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 is that where different people and different peoples can actually exist and be who they are and still be citizens of the state. And she,
Yeah.
a huge part of her early work, and in fact her first major work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is written in the 1940s while she's here, is a critique of the nation state, and
Mm,
an
mm, mm,
argument that we need states, not nation states. And
mm. Right,
he saw
right.
the United States as the first, and at that point only, non-nation state in the world. And
And that's crucial, because look at the damage of and the both the heritage and the threat now also of the nation state. So that's not a it's not a dead thing.
that,
Uh, yeah, and also I just want to say, like, like everything that is true, there's different facets of a truth that might appear to be opposites, but it's all part of the same thing, which is that as much as I struggle, and she must have struggled with the not writing initially in German, and thank God she rewrote it all in German. She had to do that. She had to do that because she had to own her thinking and her thought and her writing. So she had to do this. She knew very well what her relationship was to her mother tongue. And by the way, it was different to some of her fellow refugees, the ones that refused ever to speak German, or the ones who would not speak to their children in German, etc. And she says, quite specifically, it wasn't the German language that committed these crimes, etc., etc. So, so I just want to say that the fact that she wrote in English is also an expression of her being in the world.
yeah,
This was the manifestation of of what happened to her being expelled from home.
that's right. No, I think
Yeah.
that those are all true. Vivian, I want to take some of this conversation we've been having about history and citability and
Mm,
metaphor and
mm.
language, and look at and talk about maybe one or two of the paintings. You have three paintings in the exhibit at the gallery.
Oh yeah.
So one of them, Poland is on Pluto. A change is going to come. Um, uh, it's got at least 3 parts. You can tell me if I'm getting it right. One is a map of Table Mountain in Cape Town, where you're from. One is the text written, I assume, by you, or script of the Sam Cooke song "A Change Is Gonna Come." And then there's a quotation from Immanuel Kant, a very famous quote from the end of the second critique, the critique of practical reason.
Mm.
The starry heaven above me and the moral law within me. 3 different citations, 18th century, 20th century, and maybe 19th century, the map. I'm not sure when the map is from. Um, how do you see these citations working together, or is that a fair question? Do you not want to? I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I mean, uh, I, I look at the Kant, right? The starry heaven above me is Kant's articulation of the of the meaninglessness and just utter smallness of man, right? I look at the stars and I realize how insignificant I am.
Well, yes, but there's more wonder in it than that.
Well,
It's
yeah, but the wonder also comes from
mm,
the moral law within me. This
mm,
small, insignificant nothing in the
mm, mm,
galaxy
mm,
has the universal law in
mm,
me. And thus I'm a rational being. And as a rational being, I know that my telos, my end, my goal is not to just do what I want and be sensible and be happy, but to live up to my rationality. And that means um, living in a moral life.
yeah.
And so that's an extremely powerful sentence. It's on Kant's tombstone, as I'm sure you know, in Königsberg. Um, uh, uh, you know, what made you decide to put that on this painting, or how did that come about?
It, it's very literal. I think that my paintings, once you sort of get the key, it's really quite sort of literal. There are the stars above in the sky in the painting,
Mm,
and that's why. But it definitely is linked to the idea of the moral law, because that the Sam Cooke version of the song "A Change Is Gonna Come," was very much part of the civil rights era and the struggle for equality and for rights for African Americans and or all people who are disenfranchised and who are not who were not steering the reins of power. And so that's why. And because I did tell you that initially that there is this sort of even though I think the word Königsberg does not appear, the name of the city of Königsberg doesn't appear in that painting. It's there by through that Kant quotation, and it's in this show, I think, because Arendt was born there, so it's all sort of linked. I know that is. Use the word a stupid link. It's just very literal. It's a simple link. I think that I think sometimes things are simple. I think that and that goes for the idea of moral law. I think that this. I think for me, when I think about what this means to try to live a moral life, or at least to think about how we fall short every moment of every day of that is the idea that oh wait, I've gotten lost. I'll come back to that. I've gotten lost. I was speaking about the things things are because I made a claim that things that appear difficult are sometimes simple. I wanted to say that in any given life situation that we all deal with, you know, when somebody dies, or when we do something that is really wrong, and things that are wrong are things that hurt other people, sometimes in ways that we can't know. Those are the things that I mean when I say when we do something wrong. I think that people get, for me, when I look around, as I know, because I said to you earlier that what is obvious to most people is almost never obvious to me, and that I struggle with that. I think my brain works a bit differently, and I think that, but yet, when I look around me at some of those people that I consider to be incredibly proficient in the way that they live their life or pay their bills or things like that, I find most people seem to be so confused about things that I consider to be incredibly basic. And I think that life is very difficult and life is very painful. And the Buddhists talk about this, and I think it's absolutely right. Life is a struggle, it's painful. And yes, we are permanently deluded about most things. Our attachment is about delusion. But I think that it's difficult and painful, but there are few human situations that are truly complicated. I think there is a difference. And that's what I mean by simple. I think that people are confused because they think that all tricky situations are complicated, but actually it's that they're difficult, or it might be painful or hard to make a choice. That's all. And so that's where the moral law bit comes in relation to the song, that beautiful song.
Right.
And
It strikes me, it strikes me that in your work, and I love this, and I think it comes back to our earlier conversation. In your work, the moral law and the mountain, the tabletop mountain, and the song are not allegories; they're metaphors.
Yeah.
They're sort of, they don't need interpretation. They're physical things
Yeah.
that point to something
Yeah.
that one sort of gets a feeling of. They're the ineffable, right?
Yeah. Doesn't Arendt talk about emblems there?
Mhm.
Emblems. Yeah.
Yeah, and she makes this distinction between allegory, which needs to be interpreted, and metaphor, which is sort of the flesh. The
Yeah.
metaphor is metaphors are the way that we poetically sort of bring an
Carry
idea into the
idea.
world.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we talked on our walk about, there's abstract painting, and you said, what's the opposite of abstract painting? And I said, well, representational or figurative, but it strikes me that there's a third, right? Or there's allegorical painting, but then metaphorical painting. And that's really how I've come to see what you're doing. And it's very much in this Benjaminian Arendtian tradition.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about Arendt, and look, the book that I gave you these chapters from, which is The Life of the Mind, was never finished. It's not edited. It is one of the most difficult books of hers because it was never finished.
I held up the wrong book. Sorry.
It's all right.
This time, and you were too polite to say I was holding.
It's all right. I got it in there. But no, it's the point is that what I love about Arendt is that some of her writing is really accessible, and some of her writing is a little bit more academic or whatever. But in all of her writing, even the most academic, and it's not really truly academic, but even the most academic of her writing, there are aphoristic phrases throughout.
Yeah.
And so not everyone reads Arendt this way, but I certainly do. I read Arendt as an aphoristic writer. The way I read her is I go through, and there is a structure to her writing, and there is a way to follow it in a logical way. But you have to connect the aphorisms.
Yes, it's so right. It's like, imagine a map of the night sky and the constellations being. It's like that. This makes her Benjaminian.
Yeah.
And because because her first thing is thinking through language and poetry, and I think that that's her. And then I have to say that I've never read anything she's written on Lukács, but sometimes she speaks like, especially in the human condition and stuff, and labor and reification and stuff like that. I think she is the classical Marxist for me, in the sort of Lukácsian tradition, although maybe, yes, I think so. What did she have to say, by the way? I will come back to my painting, by the way, but what did she have to say about Lukács?
I don't know that she ever read Lukács or not.
Really? Wow.
She may have. I don't recall. I mean, she
Mm.
certainly wrote a lot about Marx. She spent 2 years in the 1950s working on a book on Marx that she never published.
She never published.
She never published the book. She published many parts of it. 2 of the chapters of the book, or that were going to be in the book, are published in the book Between Past and Future. The first 2 chapters. So the one called The Modern Concept of Tradition. I mean, tradition.
Right, tradition and the modern age.
And the other one called The Concept of History.
Concept of history, right.
Are both essays that came out of her work on Marx in this period. And she's very, she thinks Marx is brilliant, and
yes, I for what it's worth, so do I.
But is critical of Marx, insofar as Marx, for her, commits the error that commits exactly the error. It's the opposite of what you and I have been talking about, Vivienne, which is that he seeks to subordinate the spontaneity and freedom of human life to theories and science, and to make all of what man does conform to dialectical materialism, or a science of history, and sees man as simply a lawful being carrying out, general laws that we can figure out. And this reduction of man to a lawful and not a free being, and thus this elevation of social science over the sort of pearl diving, aphoristic freedom of the poet and of the actor, is for her the legacy of Marx in the modern world that she sees to be incredibly dangerous. But so yeah,
of course, she had already the hindsight of history when she spoke about the danger. But I think that for anyone who has read anything that Karl Marx has actually written, or at least some of Karl Marx, I think that it's also fairly painful. I mean, here was a great thinker who put all of that at the service of an idea of freedom, so that it's one thing to make the criticisms that we're also familiar with, and of course with the Soviet legacy and all of this, with a whole 100 years of legacy, or 150 years of it, but yet it was all about, it was all about freedom, wasn't it? I mean, that was the goal, or what was wasn't it?
So it was
even about freeing up our minds in order so that we weren't slaves, labor slaves, that we were free to exist in the world and think and be.
Yeah, I mean, she thinks that Marx, in the end, completely misunderstands freedom. She thinks he understands freedom as the achievement of the of the sort of laws of history into a kind of utopia that has been, uh, you know, thought through, and not spontaneity, and not, the ability to do the unexpected. Um, and
Maybe, but since he understood capitalism more than absolutely anybody, just about before or since,
yeah,
that hardly matters to me. Do you know what I mean? Because he was
and
so right and
she's
continues to
not
be. Yeah,
critical of him on
mm,
that regard at all.
yeah,
And she certainly is critical of capitalism. She's also critical of socialism, but
yeah,
um, we're running out of time. I know they wanted us to keep this somewhat short. I thought I'd end by just asking a little bit about one of the other paintings in the exhibit, your Terezin painting,
yeah.
Joseph, 1991, which
Yeah.
I understand is it your re-rendering of a child's painting from Terezin, or is it the actual copy or the actual painting in there?
Yeah, well, just think of the phrases you've used here in order to formulate your question. Yeah, words are important. It references a found image, yes.
Mhm.
So I encountered that scrappy little drawing by someone called Joseph in reproduction in a Soviet produced pamphlet, so kind of fuzzy little reproduction of a scrappy pencil drawing. This is uh, my perfect image from which to work. But I've stuck pretty closely to the facts. The facts mean the marks that connote representations of certain things, and so everything you see there is something that it would be fair to say Joseph put in his scrappy drawing as well. It was very, at the time, because I made this in 1991, I think. I'd gone all the way to Prague to pick up this pamphlet. Literally, it wouldn't be untrue to say that, so that I could then make a bunch of paintings. But it was very much part of uh, um, my approach at the time and my conscious thinking, that because I myself felt so unhinged and homesick that I was going to salvage a scrappy little drawing, the original of which I've never seen, um, uh, and make something of it physically substantial, read heavy and big. Yes, so that it couldn't just be squashed into the ground.
Yeah, that's perfect, because that was where my question was going. Because just looking at the painting, and I can comparing it to, for example, the first painting we discussed, right? Poland is on Pluto. There's not the Kantian, the moral law within us. There's not the obvious, hopeful, if we will, idea or metaphor. Um, and yet, and so in some ways, looking at this image that you've drawn of Joseph's image of someone being, I think, hung, in a very is just bone shattering. I mean, it really is. It's a bone shattering image to me. And yet the fact that it's been salvaged, the fact that it happened, the fact that art was made out of it, and that you're salvaging it, is to me the symbol of hope. I mean, and it reminds me, I know the first book of Arendt's you told me you read was Eichmann in Jerusalem. And in Eichmann in Jerusalem, at the end, she says, the holes of oblivion do not exist. What she
Mm.
means by that is the concentration camps were attempts to actually make human freedom disappear, and that things that humans did would never be known and would
Mm.
disappear from the world. And in the origins
Mm.
of totalitarianism, in the last chapters, she sort of describes these camps as holes of oblivion where people were disappeared. But in Eichmann, she revises that and says, what we've learned 20 years after the fact is that the stories are being told, things are coming out, and we can remember, and we can know. And that was for her incredibly hopeful idea.
Well,
And
yes, but she also says, I think, in that interview with what's his name,
Gauss, yeah.
Gunter Gauss. Yeah, I think it's in that one where she says, you know, does she speak of forgiveness? They can, or making something better. We can forgive this, but we cannot forget or forgive that. What is it? The word she uses? This we cannot.
We can't forgive. We can reconcile with it, but not forgive it, I think.
It was something when she spoke about her friendly captor when she was detained in
Right.
prison in Berlin briefly.
Yes.
You know, she, you know, whatever they were hounding the Jews at the time and in the present. This also could be, this can be not forgiven, not forgotten, but somehow lived with. But that ineffable, that
Yeah, the
cannot be.
Holocaust can't be. Yes,
Right, right,
exactly. The
right.
Holocaust cannot be reconciled with, can't be forgiven or reconciled with.
No.
Yes.
Well, given that, one can't then be accused of any kind of optimism.
But okay, so that's what I was going to ask is to me, I was wondering if there's any optimism in this painting. Whereas I think in the first one on Poland, on Pluto, there is. And in this one, my
Is
original,
there?
like,
Is there?
no.
There may be. There may be. To me, that's great that you think so. I'm very happy that you think so. I don't know if you're right, though. I mean, it could just be a representation or a, let's say, a sort of culturally overused representation of idealism or a version of idealism, including including the image of a mountain to maybe symbolize heaven or there, and through that longing or the you know in spite of the fact that it is in fact not so much a map as an 18th century little engraving of the Cape Town harbor, but also with the idea, since Kant also had his Enlightenment and 18th century, which, by the way, is a moment that I happen to believe is the very best that Western civilization ever had to offer. I think prior to that was bad, and after that is worse. But that was somehow the poetic pinnacle, and that's why it all comes together there. But we also have to remember the absurdity of that. We think mountains are beautiful and they symbolize freedom, but in the 18th century, apparently aesthetically, they were regarded as pimples on the landscape. So it's sort of all there. But I'm pleased you find it sort of optimistic. I'm not sure that optimism is a viable idea at this point in time.
Yeah, I used, I guess I wanted to say hopeful, not optimistic, but whether it's optimistic or not, it provokes thought. And as you know, I'm sorry, um, uh, this book Between Past and Future, which structures this exhibit, is about what she calls the gap between past and future, the break in tradition. And it's this break in tradition where we're not governed by the metaphysical tradition, we're not governed by the past, that we
Yes.
are living in this no man's land, this gap which we have to fill. And you've made tell me a little bit about how you see it, and then we'll end.
Well, that gap that you say we're living, you make it sound like we are caught in the chasm. That you've made it sound like the gap is the chasm, but it seems like the gap is actually freedom, because the gap is the space as we sit on our walk. The gap is the space where we think. That's where critical thinking happens. And for Arendt, it's all about thinking, and thinking means critical thinking, doesn't it? It's this constant interrogation of facts and reality, and where she also what does she call it? I can't remember. Anyway, yeah. So you know, so yes, that gap is all we have to interrogate history.
Absolutely. And it's that gap where she thinks this sort of very ferment, this foment of thinking happens. And I think without a doubt, your paintings live in that gap and are incredibly provocative. So I want to thank you for those.
Thank
And
you.
I want to encourage everyone to take a look at the exhibition at the Richard Saltoun Gallery to the extent they can. Thank you very much, Vivienne. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to speak to a real Arendt scholar, and much, much appreciated and very, very stimulating for me. Thank you very much. She really, I just want to end with saying how much, what incredible admiration I have for her mind. Really marvelous.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.